Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Sister Citizen by Melissa V. Harris Perry. We are on the beginning of chapter 4, which is entitled Disaster, and this starts on page 134. I was herded like cattle, like everybody else, regardless of my ability to pay for services. Nobody cared. I was just as low on that totem pole as that lady who was on welfare with 5 kids. Quote from Denise Rubin Johnson, Hurricane Katrina survivor. To commemorate the first anniversary of Hurricane Katrina in August 2006, HBO premiered a documentary film directed by the African-American filmmaker Spike Lee. When the Levees Broke, a requiem in 4 acts, uses the enduring images of human suffering in New Orleans and the compelling narratives of hurricane victims to capture the tragedy of the disaster. Although the film is political in its thesis and conclusions, it is fundamentally an emotional tale about the heart of the experience of Katrina for the people of New Orleans. The most compelling citizen survivor to share her story in Lee's movie is Phyllis Montagny LeBlanc. Her personal testimony and stinging analysis are the captivating thread holding the film together. Irrepressible, honest, insightful, and frequently profane, LeBlanc is the impassioned voice of New Orleans who were abandoned in the aftermath of the storm. Without a hint of irony, she moves seamlessly between cursing the, quote, fuckers, end quote, in local, state, and federal government who left her and her neighbors to die, and praising the, quote, Lord God Almighty, end quote, who delivered them from the flood. She describes being hungry, hot, exhausted, and frightened. She recounts being herded like an animal, treated like a slave, and shunted from place to place, all in an accent and idiom that belong fully and exclusively to the people of New Orleans. Though it is her personal story, to listen to LeBlanc is to hear the city itself speaking. In 2008, she expanded on her role in Lee's documentary by publishing a memoir titled Not Just the Levees Broke. The text, one of the most powerful first-person accounts by an African-American woman to emerge from the storm, has a raw, urgent immediacy. It reads more like spoken language than written text. Having begun this book with the view of Hurricane Katrina framed by Zora Neale Hurston's fictional account in Their Eyes Were Watching God, let us now return to Katrina, this time guided by the true story of Phyllis Montagny LeBlanc. Recognition and visual disaster. Like all New Orleans natives, LeBlanc is both cautious and confident about storms. She does not evacuate for every bad forecast, but instead tries to discern how serious the storm is likely to be. In the days leading up to Katrina, she finds the news reports confusing and is unsure about evacuating. Quote, every time they tell us there's a hurricane, people begin running for their lives and nothing happens, end quote. Ultimately, LeBlanc and her sister chose to stay in the city because their elderly mother, quote, says her legs are hurting and we both know we aren't leaving our mama, end quote. So, like many New Orleans connected by deep social networks, LeBlanc stays in the path of the storm because it is impossible to imagine leaving part of her family behind. As a result, she and her husband, along with her mother, sister, and nephew, are trapped when her apartment complex is first battered by Katrina's winds, then flooded by the levee breach. As days pass without electricity, gas, or running water, LeBlanc desperately tries to call for help. Finally, she gets through to an operator, but is frustrated to learn that the operator cannot connect her to 911 or help her in any substantive way. Through her fear and agony, she questions the operator, saying, quote, I am a person, a living, breathing person with a heart beating inside of a body, and you can't help me, end quote. LeBlanc's demand that the operator acknowledge her as a, quote, living, breathing person, end quote, is a request for recognition. She is asking to be seen and to be recognized as a human who is in need and deserving of help. Throughout her memoir, LeBlanc repeats this craving for recognition. She and her family have dire material needs for safety, food, water, shelter, clothing, medicine, and rest, but they also need to feel that someone acknowledges their humanity. Repeatedly, she recounts instances of misrecognition and the shame it brings. Over and over, she resists these shaming moments by reasserting her humanity. Her story makes recognition a critical part of the struggle for survival. Phyllis Montana LeBlanc reminds us that in addition to being a physical disaster, Hurricane Katrina was a catastrophe of misrecognition. When the levees failed in New Orleans, trapping thousands of Americans and destroying a major city, it became one of the few televised American tragedies. Until the events in New Orleans, only the destruction of the World Trade Center in 2001 had allowed Americans to share their fellow citizens' trauma in real time. Unlike September 11th, a single, terrible moment replayed by the media, the horror of New Orleans increased daily, produced new images of agony and death, and generated increasingly awful narratives of suffering. Americans throughout the nation witnessed hours of grisly footage and the destruction of one of America's most distinctive cities. The nation was able to watch the faces of their fellow citizens as they were unable to feed their children, comfort their parents, or find their partners. And we did watch. A Pew Foundation survey conducted within the days of the disaster showed that Americans were glued to their televisions. 70% of Americans reported that they paid very close attention to news of the hurricane, nearly twice as many as said they paid close attention to the war in Iraq. In addition, nearly 90% of Americans received most of their information about the disaster from television. About half of these viewers reported that the cable news channels CNN, MSNBC, and CNBC were their primary source of information. These sources offered blanket coverage of the disaster, beaming thousands of images of destruction and suffering into American homes. Because it was so highly visible, Hurricane Katrina offered many opportunities for recognition and misrecognition. Issues of race, gender, and politics were literally framed by what Americans saw. Okay, let's have a second to reflect here. I think what stands out so far, and this is maybe a little bit off subject some, but it's just what comes to mind when I hear this, is the phone conversation that was had with the 911 operator. And Mrs. LeBlanc speaks about how she needs help and how her family needs help, and makes this plea for acknowledgement of her being a living, breathing person. And she's inquiring why she won't be helped, why her needing help is not important, and why she can't be given the help that she needs. And that is something that is a commonality for Black people when it comes to calling 911. I would say that also uniquely Black women when calling 911. We, in the book High Rises, we read about a Black woman who had called 911 because she was getting ready to deliver her baby, and 911, the emergency paramedics came there. They thought that she was wrong and she wasn't going to have the baby, and so they left. And so she ended up needing a police officer ended up being the person to help her deliver the baby. We have, I don't know if we read about it here specifically, but there is in the Black community, in Black neighborhoods, and Black culture, an understanding that when 911 is called after someone is shot or someone is stabbed or someone is critically injured, that if you live in certain areas, it's going to take them longer to get there, that they may not get there in time to save this person's life. And from the perspective of the people in those communities and neighborhoods, that is because their lives are not deemed as important, or because their lives are not deemed as a priority, or the pain or whatever it is that they're in is not viewed as a priority in this racist system that we live in. So a lot of times you'll hear about someone being shot or someone being stabbed or someone being in need of medical treatment or medical assistance in these Black communities, these Black neighborhoods. And instead of waiting for the ambulance to come, you put them in a car and you take them there yourself. And even here, there's somebody right now suing the police department for not allowing an ambulance to come in quick enough to save somebody's life after they've been shot and the person ended up dying. And so in all of those things, hearken me to the song by Public Enemy, which is entitled 911 is a Joke. And in the song, Flavor Flav, Public Enemy, talks about how when black people and people in the community need 911, that they're never there. But when it's time for police officers to break into somebody's home, or when it's time for police officers to violate somebody's constitutional rights, that they can do those things with expediency. And so that's just what stands out reading that, is how many unique experiences and interactions that take place in this American society have a disproportionate negative impact on black people because of the effects of white supremacy and because of the effects of racism. Let's continue reading. If most Americans were watching the same unfolding tragedy from the same news sources, it is reasonable to expect that they formed a general consensus about the disaster and its meaning. No such consensus existed. Data collected in the weeks and months following the levee breach show that black and white Americans had vastly different opinions about the storm despite having seen very similar images. This reinforces the lesson that recognition is always a matter of interpreting and giving meaning to the images we encounter. For example, one academic study offered evidence that the coverage of Katrina differed markedly between the black press and the mainstream newspapers. Black papers were far more likely to refer to race and poverty and far less likely to attribute the situation of those left in New Orleans to their individual responsibility. Another study showed that media coverage actually made the residents of local communities that hosted Katrina evacuees less supportive of the poor and African Americans. Hurricane Katrina was not colorblind in its effects, and Americans were not colorblind in their interpretations of the disaster. There was a vast racial disparity between how black and white Americans understood the lessons of the storm. Nearly all respondents to this early Pew survey were discontent with the government's response to the emergency, but white and black Americans viewed the disaster across a wide perceptual gulf. While 71% of blacks believe that the Katrina disaster showed that racial inequality remains a major problem in the country, a majority of whites, 56%, felt that racial inequality was not a particularly important lesson of the disaster. 77% of African Americans believed the federal government response was fair or poor, and although a majority of whites agreed, the percent was much smaller, 55%. In a stunning racial disjuncture, 66% of African American respondents believed that if most of the victims had been white, the responses would have been faster. 77% of whites believed that race made no difference. In short, while most white Americans saw the hurricane's aftermath as tragic, they understood it primarily as a natural disaster, followed by technical and bureaucratic failures. Most black Americans saw it as a racial disaster. For black Americans, the catastrophe was not just a matter of slow government response. The lack of coordinated response was itself an indication that black people did not matter to the government. This racial gap suggests that many African Americans believe that their white counterparts misperceived the realities of the storm. By this interpretation, white Americans were not recognizing the role played by racial inequality and bias, and because they could not or would not recognize it, they would surely fail to address it. The connection between recognition and potential political action was important. Survey data make clear that the vicarious experience of the disaster had immediate and dramatical political consequences. The Pew study reported that 67% of Americans believed that President George W. Bush could have done more in his handling of the relief effort, and nearly 60% rated the federal government's response as fair or poor. The disaster also caused many Americans to reconsider the nation's security, with 42% reporting that the events surrounding Hurricane Katrina made them feel less confident that the government could handle a major terrorist attack. In the aftermath of the hurricane, President Bush's job approval ratings plummeted and never fully rebounded. The Democratic Party won a majority in the House of Representatives and Senate and won the White House in 2008. Many observers point to the Katrina disaster as both a national tragedy and a political turning point. The failure of the Bush administration to respond to the crisis in New Orleans mattered politically. I think what stands out from what we just read and what is a highlightable section, sort of missed it as we were reading, was the survey about how people perceived Hurricane Katrina. And you see how vastly differently black people perceived it than white people perceived it. And that is something that is still very relevant and very trying to find a word. That's something that just still has relevance not only to Katrina or natural disasters, but just to everyday life. Not only to like a phenomenon that may happen, but to everyday life. And if you were to do surveys on how people perceive everyday life, you would see that the majority of black people will perceive life to be in a slanted room because of their blackness, and sometimes it may not be tangible. That's one of the things that begins to exist with when you have social constructs like race is that I may walk into a store and get followed around the store, and it just may be procedure for the store to follow anybody around the store that's in a certain age group. But as a black person who's experienced being followed around a store because I'm black before that, as a black person who understands the stigma that is connected with being criminal and the criminalization that is connected with being black in this country, part of my experience in being followed around the store is going to have the specter of blackness around it. And so I said that to say, when moments like Hurricane Katrina happen, when moments like acts of police violence happen, there are when you speak about poverty, when you speak about any of these macro political events or social events, people are going to perceive them differently based on race. But even when you just talk about day-to-day events, how somebody got treated in the line at a restaurant, how somebody was treated when they walked into a store, you'll see how much the specter of race really hangs over black people and people of color. And I think that goes back to some of the things that we've touched on with the concepts of shame and the concepts of stigma. And I think that what's important about this is being able to identify the political ramifications that exist within a social event. And I think that Melissa V. Harris Perry does a good job of using Hurricane Katrina and the aftermath of it, which is important as well. It's not just the event, but the aftermath of it. And she does a good job of using that as a social event, to have a conversation about the politics that surround it. Okay. Although the partisan effects of recognition become obvious in the years following Katrina, the racial terms of recognition mattered as well. Throughout her nightmare, LeBlanc is convinced that the refusal to acknowledge her humanity is related to her race. After a 5-day ordeal, she and her husband finally reach Louis Armstrong Airport, where they await evacuation. The airport has become a place of squalor, filth, and death. Feeling trapped and frightened, she becomes increasingly distraught and worries they may never escape to a safe location. A core feature of her anguish is her sense that the officials in charge of the rescue are cruel and unwilling to acknowledge her. This uncaring attitude is embodied in the expressionless armed guards in the airport. LeBlanc becomes irate watching their robotic responses to such enormous distress. Quote, "My emotions are starting to crumble. My mind is falling apart and I don't care anymore. This is wrong and it's driving me crazy. I can't hold it together anymore. This is inhuman. We are human beings. Look at us. Look at us." They never budge. They never even look at me, and I know they can hear me because I'm standing right under them at the bottom of the escalators. End quote. For LeBlanc, this refusal to recognize her is not incidental, but racial. Her experience of surviving Katrina repeatedly draws forth an analogy to slavery. When she finally makes it to an evacuation center in Houston and takes her first shower in nearly a week, she begins to weep as she reflects on her experience. Quote, "I burst into tears. but soft tears so nobody can hear me. My heart is so broken. My government and my country does not care about me, us, the chocolate people. The tears fall down my face soft and quick, but fall hard on the wooden plank underneath my feet. And then I feel like a slave again. I mean, I know that I could never insult the history of my ancestors by comparing what I am going through with what they endured. But this has the, quote, air of enslavement, end quote. That is how I feel. So I decided to try to wash that feeling away with that little tiny piece of soap, end quote. LeBlanc's tears are not just personal, they are political. Her suffering is not solely about the loss of home, the agony of hunger, or the separation from family. LeBlanc weeps the tears of an abandoned citizen. She recognizes herself as linked to a tradition of black suffering. For her, Katrina is a form of temporary enslavement. She is haunted by nightmares for months afterward. One reoccurring dream combines her sense of racial and political betrayal. Quote, sometimes in my dreams, I see the mayor of New Orleans, the governor of Louisiana, and the president of the United States watching me die, and they are laughing, and they are all saying I'm just one less nigger in the world, end quote. In Chapter 3, I argued that shame is an emotional response to misrecognition. This is true at both the individual and the collective level. Phyllis Montana LeBlanc uses the word shame throughout her memoir. She repeatedly experiences shame during the evacuation when she is ignored or misrecognized by others, especially those in positions of authority. While waiting to board a flight at Louis Armstrong Airport, she waits in a very long line to retrieve a bagged meal. As she stands in line, she notices that black people in the line are being treated differently from their white counterparts. White storm victims are encouraged or allowed to request specific items in their bag, but African Americans are told they must accept whatever is given. Quote, the people who are giving out the food bags are mostly white, and the people making requests for our particular type of cookie or chips are being satisfied, and when the black people ask for the same, they are told they can get only what is left over. But then, another white person requests their same choice and gets it. I saw this with my own two weary eyes. I just take what is given me and walk away, feeling somewhat shameful and honestly like a nigger, an animal, end quote. Her sister experiences shame for needing to rely on charity. She says, quote, I feel so ashamed of myself. I mean, people are feeding us, and cheaply, I might add. It might seem like I don't appreciate what they're doing, but I do. I'm rather taking a shot at how our government has left us in a position to make people feed us like a pack of animals, end quote. When LeBlanc first sees images of the flooded city at the Houston Evacuation Center, her anger returns as she thinks of how many people have died in the flood. But as she watches the devastation wrought on her home and remembers the long delay in government response, she again wants to hang her head. Quote, I can't believe my eyes. The water from the levees has practically covered our entire city. They don't show bodies, but they are saying that tens of thousands are feared dead, drowned. Feared? What in the fuck do you mean, feared? Had they come when we got hit, there would be no feared. I just put my head down in shame and walked back to where Ryan is sitting, end quote. LeBlanc's memoir encourages us to consider the political effects of the misrecognition that accompanied Hurricane Katrina. LeBlanc is not the only African American survivor to speak of shaming and humiliation as core aspects of the experience. Deanne Penner and Keith Ferdinand collected dozens of oral histories from displaced Black New Orleans in their book, Overcoming Katrina, African American Voices from the Crescent City and Beyond. Many of their narrators tell of being shamed by military and government personnel who misperceived them as dangerous, poor, and criminal. One of the narrators, Denise Rubian Johnson, is a middle-class Black nurse who was trapped in New Orleans because her husband, a stroke survivor, was too ill to evacuate. During the storm, she finds a room at University Hospital for her husband and son and offers her nursing assistance in exchange. She is trapped along with patients and other medical staff for more than 5 days without necessary equipment or supplies. The first rescuers who appear are local and small boats. When military personnel finally arrive on the 6th day after the levee breach, they treat the survivors roughly rather than with compassion. Ruby N. Johnson attributes this behavior to racial discrimination. Quote, "We were labeled as poor black people, and we looked the part. We were smelly, so it didn't matter that I live in this Eastover house that I built, and I drive a Lexus RX 350, and I make a substantial income. None of that was relevant. Katrina was the great equalizer. I got frisked just like the woman next to me from the housing project. I had to stand in line in the hot sun just like everybody else. I had to go to the bathroom just like everybody else. I got yelled at to shut up just like everybody else." End quote. Rubion Johnson's description shows how collective humiliation arises from the stereotypes of the crooked room. She is adamant that no person, black or white, rich or poor, deserve to be treated badly in these difficult circumstances. She is also clear that the rough treatment she gets is related to the negative race and class stereotypes that influence how black Americans are perceived. And that brings us to the end of that theme within this chapter.